Hello and welcome to Family Matters, a webinar from the Deseret News and the Institute for Family Studies. On Family Matters, we tackle the most important questions related to our most important social institution, family. Today, we're tackling this question: do fathers matter for Black children and for kids in general? I'm Brad Wilcox, a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a contributor at Deseret News. And today I'm moderating a panel of distinguished scholars and educators. We have Dr. Glenn Loury, who's the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Economics at Brown University, and Mr. Ian Rowe, who's the founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies and a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, before we start, I want to kind of bring in another voice to this conversation, the voice of President Barack Obama. And here he is speaking on fatherhood at Morehouse College.
I was raised by a heroic single mom, wonderful grandparents, made incredible sacrifices for me. And I know there are moms and grandparents here today who did the same thing for all of you. But I sure wish I had had a father who was not only present, but involved. Didn't know my dad. And so my whole life, I've tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle where a father's not at home, where a father's not helping to raise that son or daughter. I want to be a better father, a better husband, a better man. It's hard work that demands your constant attention and frequent sacrifice. And I promise you, Michelle will tell you I'm not perfect. She's got a long list of my imperfections. Even now, I'm still practicing, I'm still learning, still getting corrected in terms of how to be a fine husband and a good father. But I will tell you this, everything else is unfulfilled if we fail at family, if we fail at that responsibility.
So here we have got one example of President Obama crisscrossing the country, giving speeches about the importance of fatherhood at churches and colleges across the nation. In listening to the president speak and watching his own example, no one could doubt that President Obama understood how much fathers mattered for kids. In fact, I think his comments on fathers are emblematic of the way in which the kind of culture wars over family, wars over fathers, single motherhood, and marriage kind of seemed to wrap up in the early 20th century. In fact, in 2015, there was a consensus statement kind of given by scholars at Princeton and Brookings, and that statement read as follows, quote, "Most scholars now agree that children raised by two biological parents in a stable marriage do better than children in other family forms across a wide range of outcomes," unquote. But I think today what we're seeing is that progressives are actually trying to reopen the wars over family structure, calling into questions, even arguments that Obama had made powerfully and poignantly about fathers here in America. This month, for instance, the Harvard Gazette ran an article entitled, quote, "Why Living in a Two-Parent Home Isn't a Cure-All for Black Students." Written by Harvard sociologist Christina Cross, it spotlighted research showing that poor Black kids with two parents do not do better in a few educational outcomes compared to their peers with single parents. And she was revisiting a theme that she'd articulated in an earlier New York Times article called "The Myth of the Two-Parent Home." Now, one obvious implication of her argument is that ultimately Black fathers are less important for Black kids than they are for other kids. I want to begin in terms of this panel by asking Glenn, what do you think Cross is up to here in this series of articles, and what do you make of her arguments about two-parent families and Black kids more generally?
I think what she's up to is trying to control the narrative. So you're talking about poverty and racial disparities, and one narrative would call attention to the structure of family. Another narrative would talk about resources and talk about social programs. And I think she's trying to drive the conversation in the direction of, let's talk about resources. But I actually don't think her research demonstrates what she seems to be claiming, which is that fathers are not so important. taking it at face value, it seems that she's saying the benefit that is associated with two-parent families is not as great amongst African Americans as amongst whites, which is a different thing from saying that there's not a benefit from two-parent families altogether. So I take it as an intervention designed to have a political influence more so than a social scientific finding that should change the way we think about these things.
I think one of the ironies here is that when you're kind of thinking about this recent work from Harvard, is that kind of just across the campus at Harvard, the economist Raj Chetty and his team have been doing a lot of work on economic mobility, kind of looking at how poor kids rise or not across the course of their lives. And what Chetty and his team have found is that there's a kind of a connection between family structure in the neighborhoods and how Black boys are doing in particular, and then also how poor kids more generally are doing. Glenn, what's the story there that Professor Chetty has been telling us empirically at Harvard?
Well, it seems that he's put his finger on an important distinction. A community that has a lot of fathers, Black fathers in it, is a healthy ecological environment for social mobility for Black boys, which is a different thing from saying that as between two households, one where the father is present or not, it makes a big difference that the father is there. That's also true, but Chetty's finding, I think, underscores the importance of fathers, especially for social mobility for Black boys.
Right, and then what do you make too of his finding that when it comes to economic mobility for poor kids, kind of in general, the number one, and again, it's a predictor, it's not, there could be other factors obviously in play, but as he kind of looks at these different factors, he finds that sort of the number one predictor of mobility for poor kids was the share of single parents in community. In fact, finds one reason that Salt Lake City has such high rates of mobility for poor kids is that there are relatively more two-parent families in Salt Lake. How does that strike you?
Well, as you say, it's hard to get causality kind of precisely identified in these aggregate data, but it's just another piece of evidence in the general common sense direction that a healthy and stable family environment promotes the development of youngsters and their later life success.
So Ian, I want to kind of bring you in this conversation, and you recently co-authored a brief from the Institute for Family Studies on the two-parent family and the welfare of Black boys and girls. What does the brief find, and what does it kind of suggest to us about how much two parents, how much dads matter when it comes to Black kids and of course kids more generally in terms of their odds at kind of realizing the American dream?
Yeah, thanks, Brad and Glenn. Great to do this with you. Yeah, Brad, as you said, it was sort of a settled question that most people agreed with the basic idea that kids are better off being raised in a married two-parent household versus by a single parent. But there's been an emerging narrative to try and explain, why are racial disparities occurring in poverty and other areas. And I think there's a dominant narrative brewing, which is that it's all about systemic racism or other structural factors. And so when there are opposing arguments or complementary arguments, such as there might be other things, they're met with some hostility. So it does seem like there's an attempt to sort of reframe the discussion that the primary causality is all about structural or systemic barriers around race. So we decided to do a study that really asked two questions. The first, quite simply, are Black children more likely to flourish in an intact two-parent home with their father and mother as compared to Black children raised by either single parents or step families? And we looked at this through the prism of three different indicators: child poverty, college graduation, and incarceration. And then the second question we asked is the association between family structure and child outcomes markedly different by race? Meaning that is the impact solely a function within the Black community or in the white community? Some of the high level findings in terms of the differences in terms of how Black kids do based on different family arrangements, it's quite striking. If you're a child, a Black child being raised with a single parent, your percent poverty rate is 46%. that compares to only 13% if you're being raised by two parents in a first marriage. That's a 3.5 times multiplier, which is obviously meaningful. And as we've said, causality is hard to pin down, but that's certainly an important indicator. And in general, I mean, across graduation, poverty, incarceration rates, Black children raised by single parents are 3 times more likely to be poor compared to Black children raised by their own married parents. Black boys are almost half as likely to end up incarcerated, twice as likely to go on and graduate from college. These are, again, we can't establish causality, but these are important factors that need to be part of the debate, because if we look at the world solely through the prism of race and believe that it's monocausal, that the issues are structural racism or structural barriers, then we won't deploy solutions that are encouraging the creation of stable two-parent families and engaged fathers. And we also find that Black children from two-parent homes do better than white children from single-parent homes when it comes to poverty or incarceration. And again, this is just very important data that you rarely hear in the general populace.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I guess I also want to have you sort of reflect. I mean, you've been an educator now for many years, working in the New York City metro area. In fact, you had a powerful experience the first day you were working in the South Bronx for the charter school network that you founded in New York City, Public Prep. And that experience, I think, tells us a lot about the relationship today between class and fatherhood in America. Can you tell us a bit about that experience and kind of how it sort of shaped your thinking about fathers and class and opportunity here in America?
Well, years ago when I was running this network of public charter schools, we had just moved our headquarters to the Bronx, because we were to the South Bronx in particular, because we were going to be opening all of our new schools, elementary and middle schools, in the South Bronx, because these are districts in which only 2% of students who started high school, started 9th grade, 4 years later graduated from high school ready for college. And so having outstanding educational choices has to be part of the equation to uplift our communities. And in one of the first days that we were there, my team, we took a walking tour, saw a 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with several people around it that were very excited. And it had the words, "Who's your daddy?" In graffiti letters on the side. And it turned out that truck was a mobile DNA testing center in which primarily low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 to $500 to answer questions such as, are you my sister? Could you be my father? Really deep questions about identity and family structure. And I discovered that the non-marital birth rate in this particular area of the South Bronx was more than 85%. And it really led me down a pathway to say that, family structure matters. I mean, every kid in our school, regardless of their family structure, we had very high expectations. We expected them to, rule the world no matter what. But we could no longer ignore how much family structure mattered. And so when we're talking about how to educate young people going forward, it's really important that they understand the series of life decisions that give them the greatest rewards or potentially greatest consequences, not only for their life, but that of their future children. So when you look at data, for example, associated with things like the millennial success sequence, when you finish your education, just a high school degree, full-time work of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if you have children, marriage first, 97% of the people who've done that avoid poverty. Now, again, can't establish causality, and there isn't only one way, but this is important information young people need to be taught. Young people of all races, by the way, need to be taught, because frankly, it's an equal opportunity tsunami when fathers are not in the picture. Brad, you also wrote a piece recently in The Atlantic about how and why fathers matter for all kids. How do they matter? It's crazy that we're even asking this question, but given the current narrative, it seems like we have got to rehash this kind of information.
Yeah, Ian. So what I reported in the Atlantic a number of years ago is that we see less delinquency, less depression, less teen pregnancy among teenagers who have good relationships with their dads. And when it comes to kind of thinking about sort of what's going on here, I think the argument is that dads play a distinctive role when it comes to playing with their kids, when it comes to providing for their kids, when it comes to disciplining and challenging their kids. That's the kind of the big picture here in this Atlantic piece that I wrote.
Yeah, Brad, what are some of the ways in which we know that dads play a uniquely distinctive role for their kids, independent from moms?
What we see, in the research is that when it comes to play, for instance, dads are much more likely to engage in vigorous play, exciting play, unpredictable play, from roughhousing with their kids on a Saturday morning to playing catch with their kids in the backyard on a spring afternoon. Ross Park, a psychologist, has found that kids who have this kind of playful interaction with their dads are more likely to be flourishing socially, in school, for instance. And we also see that dads are more likely to kind of challenge their kids, to encourage them to face difficulties, to take risks, to seize opportunities. And one study in France, for instance, found that moms were more likely to kind of look at their toddlers sort of eye to eye, when they were kind of teaching them how to swim. By contrast, dads are more likely to turn their toddlers around and have them kind of look out into the deep, and sort of face the sort of the deep waters. And it's kind of emblematic of how dads and moms approach parenting, often in different ways.
And then how does this relate to another outcome many parents and kids are concerned about, ironically, related to sports?
Well, when you look at kind of the research on sports, what we see is that kids who have two parents, in their corner, who have a engaged father in the corner, seem to be more likely to be flourishing in sports today. In fact, there was a New York Times article a little while ago that reported that basically professional NBA players, Black NBA players, were disproportionately likely to be born to married parents compared to unmarried parents. And as I was kind of reading this New York Times article, I was kind of thinking about the life story of Steph Curry. And he's spoken on numerous occasions about sort of the ways in which his own father played a key role in his life and also in his athletic accomplishments.
Golden State can start their celebration. It is absolutely unbelievable. What a year for Steph Curry and these Warriors.
Steph, your dad never won a championship. Can you just talk about how special that is to share this with him?
I can't be more proud of him as a father and a role model example for me through this whole journey. So I'm hoping to make him proud.
Pops, you're the example of what a true professional is on and off the court. And to be able to follow in your footsteps, it means a lot to me.
Del Curry for three.
But again, kind of the bigger story here is that, of course, a lot of us have kids who are kind of engaged in athletics nowadays. And once again, the story here that's often not necessarily publicly sort of acknowledged is that, having an engaged father, having that intact two-parent family kind of in your corner makes it easier for you to excel on the athletic, in the athletic arena today here in America.
And Glenn, you've already raised this idea of just social norms. How do social norms play? I'm curious what you think, because oftentimes it seems that a conversation focused on social norms versus structural barriers are placed at odds with each other. That if you talk about social norms, now you're blaming the victim, you're blaming the people for the plight that they're in, and it's because of the structural barriers that they're in the first place. What is the right balance between these two things? Again, not just for Black folk, but in general.
I expect that the right answer here has to be they interact with each other. It would be foolish, I think, to say that material conditions are irrelevant. On the other hand, to the extent that people are motivated by a desire to remain in the good graces and in the good opinion of people with whom they're connected, the norms within a community of expectation about how we live and what we should do will have an impact on people. I'm really not placed to be able to give a number as to the relative percentage of one versus the other.
I do like your point, though. It does seem like those in the faith community would have the greatest moral standing to be able to talk about these things, talk about both in structural terms and cultural norms, and not be, ridden out of town for moralizing, because that's what they're supposed to do.
Well, there's a larger struggle, actually, I think is a fair way of putting it, going on in the culture about what we mean by individual freedom and liberty, and the extent to which obligation and responsibility can be legitimately imposed on people. And I think that's going to be a fight that's a philosophical, and it's a spiritual as well as a social scientific debate. And I think it's going to be with us for a while.
Just to kind of follow up on that point, Glenn, so what you're sort of suggesting is that there are ways in which kind of the sort of celebration of individual freedom and sort of liberation from older ideas about marriage and family have unintentionally, I think, kind of played a role in the sort of the breakdown of the family, which in turn kind of ironically has led to more social injustice. Is that kind of the point you're getting at?
That's very well put, Brad. I wish I had said it that way myself. Exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying that the irony and tragedy of it is that for people who are well off in terms of their economic resources, this is how culture and structure can interact. They might be able to tolerate an abandonment of the strictures of, more conventional arrangements. They might be able to think about, sex out of wedlock and birth out of wedlock, and not worry so much about their family relations, because in effect, their resources allow them to compensate for that. But for people who are strapped and who are with relatively few material resources, that may be exactly when you need the coherence and the support and the stability of conventional social arrangements. And yet the culture will be driven by the lifestyles of the rich and famous to the detriment. This is not about race. This is Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart, or Robert Putnam in his book Our Kids, who are talking about the struggles of lower class people in Appalachia and whatnot. So, it's kind of like the tail wagging the dog. The rich and famous can go and do anything they want. They can smoke dope. They can have, whatever kind of relationships, and they somehow can bounce back and cushion themselves. But folks who are just working day to day, they can't live like that and still raise their children effectively.
And oftentimes those cultural elites are actually sticking to the norms in their own lives. It's just what they're publicly advocating for. Is promoting unconventional approaches to life.
Yeah, Ian, one of the things that I've been observing, we actually did a report in California a little while ago, and we found that California, elites were much more likely, well-educated Californians, to embrace family diversity kind of as their kind of public ethic. But when it came to kind of their own private orientation, they were much more likely to sort of want to have their kids in marriage compared to less educated Californians.
Yep.
They were much more likely, of course, to succeed in actually doing that. So in California, the well-educated Californians tend to have a kind of liberal, progressive public ethic about family, but privately are much more likely to embrace a kind of marriage mindset and to get and stay married for themselves, I think, and for the sake of their kids. And it's sort of part and parcel of the way in which many of our more educated Americans sort of talk left on family issues, but actually walk right when it comes to kind of their practice. So it's kind of a striking pattern. But let me kind of just close up this segment by just asking both of you if you have any sort of final thoughts about fatherhood, family, race and opportunity in America. So I'll begin with you, Ian, then I'll pivot to Glenn.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to participate. As always, I'm an educator first. And so I always start with the idea of start early with the end in mind. If we want both young women and young men to make the best decisions in their own lives, then we have to ensure that, to Glenn's point, they're in an environment in which they're seeing models of responsible parenting. And even if they're not, they're learning about the strategies associated with responsible parenting in school. They're learning about the key decisions around education, work, timing of family formation. And I would also add the importance of a faith commitment. I know Glenn talks about this, but it's a part of the maturation process that isn't given enough credit for the power and strength one can derive from having a solid faith commitment. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we have to be more deliberate about as it relates to young people's education.
The stakes are very high. I've been around for a while, and I remember the Dan Quayle, Murphy Brown controversy. I mean, who remembers this? This is all the way back to the early 1990s or the late 1980s. But the issue was whether it's okay for a woman to have a kid without a husband. And of course, it's okay. I mean, we're not going to condemn the woman and all of that. On the other hand, you got a national television program that's going out to millions of people, and what images are being put in front of those kids and those teenagers and those young adults. So, I mean, this is an ongoing struggle, and the struggle for the culture. And I think we just have to really focus, as Ian has been suggesting, on the education of youngsters. And it's going to be an uphill, steel yourselves, friends of the family, because you got a tough row ahead.
Thanks, Glenn, for that insight. Appreciate that. And I would just sort of say, I think that both, as we think about kind of these issues in general, it's clear that both structure and culture matter, that both money and marriage, to be more concrete, matter, for instance, and that as we kind of think about Father's Day coming here on Sunday, that dads matter for our kids in general, and for Black kids in particular. So as we end today's Family Matters webinar, I think it's worth listening to, again here, President Obama kind of weighing in on the importance of fathers in American life. And thank you for joining us today.
We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime. They're 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems, or run away from home, or become teen parents because the father wasn't in the home. The foundations of our community and our country are weaker because of this. And what I've realized is that life doesn't count for much unless you're willing to do your small part to leave our children, all of our children, a better world. Even if it's difficult, even if the work seems great, even if we don't get very far in our lifetime. That's our responsibility as fathers and as parents, to try, to hope. We do what we can to build our house upon the sturdiest rock. And for me, that means building that rock, building that house on the foundation of Jesus Christ. Because I'm going to make mistakes, and sometimes it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for me as a father. It's going to be hard for me as a husband. It's hard for me as a public servant. But if I can instill in my children that sense that God is looking out for us, that He's going to be there for us during the darkest hour, that He's going to be there for us no matter what happens, no matter what winds blow, then I know that I can succeed, and I know they will succeed.